Welcome to the next installment in AlertFind's webinar series, Active Shooter Preparedness, Life-Saving Strategies from a Law Enforcement Expert. Today's webinar is an update to our most popular webinar. We're going to be covering all of the same foundational information and tactics with some updates and new material. You can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtags ActiveShooterTraining and AFWebinar, and we will be live tweeting at AlertFind.com. I am so thrilled today to welcome back Jay Bryant, Active Shooter Training Expert. Jason is a 20-year law enforcement veteran. He trains and educates hundreds of businesses, churches, and other organizations on active shooter preparedness. And I am your moderator, Danielle Ricci, the Vice President of Marketing for AlertFind. Jay, welcome back. We're so thrilled to have you today.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to cover how to identify what organizations are at risk from an active shooter, how to create a plan to protect your employees and organization, how to use rapid notification to save lives, how to harden your physical office space, and how to use evade, shelter, and barricade and counterattack to protect yourself and your employees.
Hi, my name is Jay Bryant. I've been in law enforcement for about 21 years. And in that time, we've really thought about what we could do to increase our response to active shooters. And part of that is getting the message out to the public and educating them on things that they can do to increase their chances of survival should they ever find themselves involved in an active shooting event. So you may ask yourself, I can't transition. My screen is locked. Sorry.
That's okay.
It's pretty well timed yes today, Bailey.
This is why we practice.
I don't know what's going on. Like I did it numerous times before.
Can you, I don't know, close it and try again, I suppose. Are you able to move through the slides at all?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. All right. All right. You get to start all over from the beginning whenever you're ready.
Hi, my name is Jay Bryant. I've been in law enforcement for approximately 21 years. And in that time, we've been increasing our response to active shooter events. And one of the things that we've learned is that we can help the public by educating them and letting them know things that they can do so that should they ever find themselves involved in an active shooter event, they can take certain steps that would increase their chances of survival. So you may ask yourself, why do I need to prepare? And it's because it's become an epidemic within the United States. In the year 2017, we had 29 active shooter events in the United States. And by active shooter, we mean a person who's intent on killing as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. So we don't want to confuse this with mass shootings. Mass shootings could be from gangland violence or drug violence or an armed robbery gone bad. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an active shooter, somebody who's going out into the public space with the expressed intent of committing mass murder. So just like on September 11th, the whole world changed in that one instant. And that morning when we all woke up, the understood way to handle the hijacking situation was to cooperate with the hijackers, and that there would be extended negotiations, and eventually there would be some sort of concessions from government, and then everybody would be released. But by the time the sun went down that day, we all knew that was no longer the way to handle it. As a matter of fact, on this flight is when they figured it out, the very last flight. We can no longer cooperate with hijackers because they're going to try and kill us anyway. Well, just how the whole world changed in an instant for hijackings on September 11th, the day for active shooters was April 20th, 1999. That was the day of the Columbine attack. Up until this point, law enforcement had been trained to surround and call out an armed gunman in a building. I'd been a police officer for approximately 2 years when this happened, and they trained us just to contain the violence and surround them and wait for the SWAT team to arrive. Then the SWAT team would enter into negotiations, and then eventually they would decide whether or not they wanted to make entry into the building. Well, this day changed, just like September 11th changed for hijacking, this day changed how we respond to active shooters. So active shooters target what we call soft targets. A soft target is an easily accessed location with a high density of people and a lack of controlled access or security. So think about where you spend most of your time during your week, during your work day, during your off time, and see if any of these images resonate with you. This could be us in a business meeting any day of the week. This could be us on Friday night. This could be us on Sunday morning. And for most of us, our biggest fear is our children. This is the ultimate soft target. An easily accessed location with a high density of people and a lack of controlled access or security. Now, these happen very quickly and they happen everywhere. Statistically, they happen in places of government about 10% of the time, and places of education about 24% of the time. And that's something that I think is important to realize, is that as many times as we've heard about school shootings, they're happening in places of business at almost double the rate. So for every school shooting that you can recollect and think of hearing, there's been 2 times that amount in places of business. I think what's important to note about places of business is just don't think of your 9-to-5 job, but when you leave work, where do you go? Do you go to the movies or to the grocery store or to a gym? All of those are places of business. The weapon systems used in these attacks, by far the most deadly handheld weapon is a shotgun, but they're rarely used because they have such a low capacity for rounds. The next most used weapon is the rifle. This is the AR-15. This is the one that's getting most of the bad press. While it has a 30-round magazine, it's a semi-automatic rifle, it's still only being used about 26% of the time. By far, the vast majority of these attacks, the most powerful weapon being used is a handgun. This is a semi-automatic handgun, which holds approximately 15 rounds depending on the model. Now, because this one is the most lethal weapon that's commonly deployed, later we'll talk about ways to defeat this weapon system. Fire. Fire has not yet been used in the United States as a weapon successfully. There's evidence to show that it's been attempted. One of the things that we've learned is that tactics that are developed in the Middle East eventually make it to Europe, and tactics that are used in Europe eventually make it to the United States. Driving a vehicle through a crowd, that's an example of a tactic that's moved across the globe. Knife attacks, very common for decades in the Middle East. We've seen them in Europe, and now we're starting to see them in the United States. A lot of people ask, well, should I hit the fire alarm if there's an active shooter? And I would advise not hitting the fire alarm, because that makes a lot of noise, which can mask the sounds of gunfire. And so people who don't realize what's going on won't be able to hear the gunfire. It also makes it very difficult for police officers when they respond to hear any clues, contextual clues as to where the shooter may be. In the Santa Fe shooting, the student pulled the fire alarm, or a teacher pulled the fire alarm, and the 2 responding SROs, school resource officers, had no idea that they were responding to an active shooting. They thought they were going to check and see why the fire alarm had been pulled, and they walked into the scene of an active shooting. So a lot of people ask, well, if the fire alarm goes off, what should I do? And I advise a look before you leave tactic. And that's when a fire alarm goes off and you're in a commercial grade building, it's not likely that it's going to burst into flames immediately. So take the time to look, maybe stick your head out your office door or look through your blinds, look through the windows, and see what's going on, and see if you can ensure yourself, is this a fire alarm, or somebody panicked during an active shooter event and pulled the fire alarm. Also in Jonesboro, the 2 boys pulled the fire alarm deliberately to get all of the kids to mass together on the playground, and that's when they launched their attack. So statistically, the shooters at large, less than 15 minutes in 87% of these events. Now, there's a few outliers that make this seem greater amount of time than what it actually is. The Las Vegas shooting, the shooter was technically at large for over 70 minutes. The US Navy Yard took a very long time, something in the neighborhood of 90 minutes to find, because that building was so big. But in the Las Vegas shooting, the shooting was only happening for about 10 minutes, but it took over 70 to finally verify that the shooter was no longer alive. So that sort of skews this stat. The average police response is 3 minutes to an active shooting in the United States. Now, if you go and Google your local police department's response time, their 911 response time, it's not going to be anywhere close to 3 minutes. It's probably going to be more in the neighborhood of 8, 9, 10, 12 minutes. And that's because dispatchers prioritize calls. So if you were to get into a fender bender in the mall parking lot and called and asked for a police officer, they would send one, but it could be up to an hour before one gets there because it's a very low priority call. But if there was a 15-car pileup on the interstate and cars are bursting into flames and rolling over, then there's going to be a massive police response, and they'll be there within a couple of minutes. If you were to average those two calls, then you have an average response time of 30 minutes. That's why police departments, their published response time is anywhere between 8 and 12 minutes. But for an event like an active shooter, you can expect a response within 3 minutes. And what you do in those 180 seconds absolutely matters. And we'll discuss that a little bit later in the program. Suspect profile. A lot of people want to know, well, can we get a profile of the suspect so we know what to look for? This is the active shooter from the Isla Vista attack. And the reason I use him, I won't say his name, nor do I think we should ever say their names, because I don't think we should add any at all to their infamy. But the reason I use this picture is because he looks so innocuous to me. He does not look like a threat at all. He looks like somebody that you would look and see and then take no notice of. Well, he terrorized his community by driving around, running over people, and then shooting at random people. And he did this continuously until the police caught up to him and were eventually able to neutralize him. So I say that to say that there is no suspect profile other than predominantly male and young, but that's the profile for almost all violent crime. So that doesn't really help us. So one of the things that we found is that every one of these events is pre-planned. 100% of them are pre-planned. There's no such thing as a spontaneous active shooter. So we've studied numerous active shooter events, and every one of them shows evidence of pre-planning, sometimes up to a year of pre-planning. This is acquiring weapons, making floor plan drawings, contingency plans, building improvised explosive devices. A full third of them have extensive plans. And what do we mean by extensive plans? I'll use the example of the Aurora active shooter. The Aurora active shooter, he built an IED, improvised explosive device, in his apartment, so big enough that it would blow up his entire apartment building. And then he wired a tripwire to the front door and left the front door slightly ajar and the music blaring really loud. The idea is that a neighbor would come and tell him to turn down his music, not get a response, and push the door open, pulling the tripwire, blowing up the apartment building. This would cause a massive response from all the first responders, fire, EMS, and police, to the apartment building, which is in a different part of town of Aurora than the movie theater. And then he put a second detonating device on a remote control car and the trigger for the remote control car. And he left that car out in the parking lot, but the triggering device went back to his apartment. The idea was if somebody didn't open the door, then somebody might find the remote control car and pick it up and trigger the IED. Then he went to the theater prior to the day of the attack, and he went to the front of the theater and the door, the exit that's right by the screen, and he walked out and measured the width of the door. He prefabricated a shim, a little small piece of metal, to go around that locking device. So on the night of the attack, after he had left his apartment wired to explode, he went to the movie theater. Then once the movie started, he walked out of the front of the theater, opened the door, put the shim on, preventing it from locking, shut the door, and now he's standing outside of the theater, but has access through the exit door. He then puts on all of his ballistic gear, his helmet, his gas mask, his rifle, gets his gas grenades, and he comes back inside. No one has noticed this. He starts throwing gas grenades, and then when people start to panic from the tear gas and they all start running to the primary exit, the one that they came into, he starts shooting into them. Only when he has a malfunction does he stop shooting, and he has to walk back out to his car because he's going to get a different gun, and that's when he is apprehended by police. The fact that he stopped shooting when he had a malfunction is important, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. So these guys have a mindset of rage. The reason I say this is because it's important to note that they will not listen to you. They absolutely, positively will not negotiate with you. So let's think about the steps that they've taken to put their plan in place. They've 100% planned it. A lot of them have extensively planned for up to a year. They've studied other active shooter events. They've seen those manifestos go public. Everybody wants to know when there's a serial bomber, they want to know why did they do it. When the Las Vegas shooter was shooting up Las Vegas, everybody wanted to know why they did it. And so these people, for whatever reason, have a burning resentment against society. And a lot of them will leave a written or a video manifesto. And they know that the more people that they kill, then the more likely that manifesto is going to make it onto national or even world news. And so by the time they've launched the attack, they've already determined the outcome. They know that they're going to kill as many people as they can, and they're likely going to die during the attack themselves. And in the process of doing this, they dehumanized their victims. So to them, you're no longer a person. So falling down on your knees in this classic pose of begging for mercy is the absolute worst thing that you can do. You have to get this out of your mind. You cannot negotiate with these people. They will not listen. They don't care who you are. They don't care if you're a father or a mother, or if you have dependent children at home or dependent elderly at home. They do not care. To them, all you are is a number, and they're trying to amass the biggest body count as they possibly can. So you might ask yourself, well, how do we defeat this threat? What do we do? And you win by winning before the attack. And how do you win before the attack? By being vigilant. Being vigilant means acknowledging that the threat exists, acknowledging that this could happen, and recognizing what it would look like if it was happening, and then having a plan in place so that if it does happen, you know immediately what to do. Part of being vigilant is having a reporting process. There should be one central location, one repository of all suspicious reports for each organization. Each school, each church, each business, each nonprofit should all know the one person that they go to report any sort of suspicious activity. That allows that one person to collect all these data points, and it paints a picture for them. I'll give an example. In the community that I live in, we had a student tell their parents, I do not want to go to school on Grandparents' Day because so-and-so is going to shoot up the school. The parents said, why do you say that? And he says, well, he told us that. He told a group of us that. So the parents called the principal and told the principal. The principal asked who else heard this, and they named off the other students, and the principal called and verified this. Now the principal was able to collect all these data points and say, this is starting to look like a real threat. Call the police department. The police department was able to send a detective out that night and go from house to house getting sworn statements from these students. With the collection of all of these sworn statements, they were able to drive to a judge's house in the middle of the night and get a warrant signed. And when the warrant was signed, patrol officers were dispatched and were able to get to that student's house before he left for school the next morning. He was actually arrested while taking a shower, getting ready to go to school. That's what I mean by having a central repository. It allows one person to collect the dots, draw the picture, and then call in law enforcement. Now, somebody might ask, what are the types of things that are suspicious? Any type of suicidal ideations, violent ideations, homicidal ideations, declaring an affinity or a love or a sympathy for any previous active shooter, statements that they want to be an active shooter, statements that they want to have the highest body count. All of these things are documented statements that other active shooters have made. Any of those types of activities should be reported. The next step is having a unified plan, and that's what we're working on here today, is that everybody in the organization being on the same page with the same plan. First, we need to limit the access to our facility. Now, the best example of this is public schools. Public schools have gotten really, really good at limiting access to their facility. So when school starts, or the 30 minutes before school and students are arriving, there's multiple entrances open and there's teachers posted at every entrance. They recognize the students and they challenge anybody who shows up who doesn't look like they belong. But once school starts, then all of those entrances are locked, and there's only one entrance into the school facility. The best design is when you have to be buzzed into the office, and then once you're in the office, you have to be buzzed into the main interior of the building. However, businesses don't have the luxury of limiting access to the same degree, partially because we want to be open for business. We want to be inviting and bringing people in. But take all the steps you can to make sure that any random member of the public can't get into your building unknown. We want them to come through the front and be acknowledged on their way in. Sounding the alarm. So I advocate that your alarm be active shooter, active shooter, active shooter. And that way it's very clear what's going on. Now this can be done over a PA system. This could be done with technology that reaches all of your employees simultaneously through text messaging. This could be done verbally. But when it's done in a loud way, either verbally or over a PA system, what it does is it also alerts people who don't belong to your organization that something's amiss. Active shooter, active shooter, active shooter is a very clear message. And as you're rushing to implement your plan, other people will follow. Now, if you don't have the ability, the luxury of a PA system, or you don't have the technology like AlertFind where you can reach all of your employees simultaneously, in lieu of those types of technology, then what we would have you do is echo the alert. And as you hear somebody yelling active shooter, active shooter, active shooter, you start to echo that alert and you start to scream it too as you put in your plan into play. And as other people hear it, they will start to yell it, and then they'll start to yell it, and that will mobilize the entire organization very, very quickly. So there's 3 stages of a crisis: denial, deliberation, and the decisive moment. So denial is when you're trying to make sense of what's going on. We don't spend our normal lives dealing with violence, and when there's a sudden eruption of spontaneous violence, it takes a second for our brain to register what's going on. You can see really good examples of this by just going to YouTube and looking at videos of armed robberies where somebody's robbing a business or a bank and other people are just standing there watching this armed confrontation and doing nothing to ensure their safety. Or sometimes you'll see videos of police officers holding somebody at gunpoint or an actual shootout, and bystanders are just standing there looking instead of taking any kind of action to ensure their own safety. A really good example of denial is in the Las Vegas shooting. Is a lot of that video was running at the time the shooting started. And when the shooting started, you heard people's first statements of denial. And they were saying things like, oh my goodness, oh my gosh, what is that? Is that gunfire? That sounds like gunfire. Could that be fireworks? It's their brain trying to catch up to what they already know to be true. Nothing sounds like gunfire but gunfire. This is a great example of denial. When we first heard the shots, we talked about whether it was an active shooter. A full 30 minutes later, when he pointed the gun at me, I left my eyes open so I would know if I died when he shot me. A young lady who survived the US Navy Yard attack told me this story. And she told me when she first heard the gunshots, she walked over to an atrium and looked over and had a conversation with her coworkers. And they talked about, I wonder what that noise is. Do you think that could be gunfire? Do you think that's an active shooter? They actually said active shooter. And they're like, no, surely not. That must be some sort of construction noise. And then they went back into the interior of the building, back to their workspace, and did nothing to ensure their safety. And then approximately 30 minutes later, the gunman confronts her. He puts the shotgun right up to her face and pulls the trigger, and just happened to have run out of ammunition. So he just continues walking, walks right past her, reaches in his pockets, and starts reloading. She only lived by that just happenstance that he happened to be out of ammunition at that time. The next stage is deliberation. Deliberation is where you think about how you're going to respond. Now, if I gave each one of you 30 minutes to prepare for an active shooter, I bet you we all could come up with a very good plan of how we're going to respond. But what if it were to happen right now? how would you respond? When human beings are confronted with violence, they often fall into fight or flight or freeze. Now, fight and flight are both acceptable, but freeze is what we're trying to get away from. Freeze is what kills us in an active shooter event. That's the absolute worst thing to do. So how do you prevent freezing? Well, having a plan in place and have practicing your plan will help you. So a lot of us think that we'll rise up to the event, but that's not what happens. We don't rise up to the challenge of an event. What happens is we fall to the level of our training. So we want to have our practice so ingrained that when the stimulus presents itself, we know exactly how to respond. I'm going to use a good example from law enforcement. In the old days of law enforcement, they used to train on revolvers, which was the old 6-gun. And when they would shoot, they would empty their brass onto the ground. And at the end of the day, they would have to clean up all that expended brass to leave the range. Well, police officers started training where they would shoot at the range and then empty the brass into their hand and put the brass into their pocket. And they would do that so they wouldn't have as much cleanup later. But what they were doing was they were training that into their response. So a police officer finds himself in an actual shootout. He's killed in the line of duty. And when they search his body after the shooting, they find expended brass in his pocket. So what does that mean? It means during the time of life or death duress, he did exactly what he trained to do. And he trained to put the brass in his hand and then put it in his pocket, which is much slower than just dumping it on the ground. That's why it's very important that we have a plan in place and that we practice our plan so that in a moment of duress, we'll rise up to our training. I'll give you another good example. Most of us could probably identify with having an argument with a significant other at some point in our lifetime. Maybe a very, very heated argument. And maybe not a significant other. It could be a coworker or a neighbor. But during that very, very heated argument, you feel the emotions flooding through you and the tension and the anxiety. And then you break away from each other and you go your separate directions. And then later, when you have time to calm down, you start thinking about things that you should have said or what you should have done. But you didn't do it in the time because you were under duress. So as you look back, you think, I could have handled that way better, or I could have said this or that, and that would have been much better than what I did say. The reason you didn't do that was because you were under duress. And when you're under duress, you don't respond at your optimal levels. So if a duress of an argument can cause you to have a deterioration in your performance, you can only imagine what the stress of an active shooter would do to your performance. And lastly is the decisive moment. Decisive moment is the time that you actually put your plan into place. And when you put your plan into place, you have to shift your emotion from fear to anger. You have to move decisively because the average response time is 180 seconds for law enforcement. When law enforcement arrives, traditionally these guys train their weapons away from the civilians and they start targeting law enforcement or they kill themselves. What you do in those 180 seconds absolutely matters. And that's why during that decisive moment, you have to take immediate action. The response plan that we advocate is evade, shelter and barricade, and then counterattack. I'm going to go through each one of these individually, but it's important to note that this is not a linear plan. It isn't evade first and then shelter and barricade and then counterattack. It's whichever step's the most appropriate for wherever you happen to find yourself at the time of the attack. So the first step is evade. Evade the shooter, shelter in place and barricade, and then counterattack the shooter. The first step is evade. What does evade mean? Evade means to evade by all means necessary. Get away as fast and as far as you possibly can. Don't walk, run. And when you run, yell active shooter, active shooter, active shooter, and take people with you. Part of evading is knowing your escape routes. Each one of us right now, wherever we happen to be when we're listening to this webinar, could close our eyes and point to the door that we walked into and the room that we walked into. How many of us could close our eyes and point to the secondary exit? That's what's so important. During the Pulse nightclub, the shooter walked in and started shooting by the front door. Well, a lot of those people in the nightclub didn't know where the exits were. And so they ran to places like bathrooms that didn't have any escape and the doors were not lockable. So then he just followed them into the bathroom and they had no way to get out. Knowing a primary and secondary escape route is paramount. You should know for every place you spend any time of your day, the copy room, your office, the conference room, the lunch room, any place where you spend time, you should know the primary and secondary escape route. And then go make sure that those doors actually work, that they haven't been nailed shut or chained shut by maintenance, that the locks haven't been changed, that they're actual viable exits. And if you're planning on using the window as an escape route, make sure the window opens, that it hasn't been screwed shut or painted shut. And then I'm going to challenge you to start taking notice of secondary exits when you're out in the public space. When you go out to eat, you can take your whole family as an experiment, tell everybody to close their eyes and point to the door. They'll all be able to point to the door they came in, and then ask them to point to the secondary exit and seeing how many people have made notice of that. It's absolutely imperative that when you walk in, you just take a quick scan of the room and you make a note of where the secondary exit is. That way, if you're ever in a position where a surprise attack is launched, you know your viable escape routes. Calling for help. You should absolutely call for help. Don't think that somebody else has called 911. You should call 911. That helps police the responding police officers understand the gravity of the attack. To put this in perspective, during the Aurora active shooter, there was 10,000 911 calls, and that lets police officers know the magnitude and the gravity of the attack. Now you might ask, what do I report to 911 when I call? The shooter location is great. If you can say the address, that's good. If you can say the name of the building, that's good. If you can give both, the address and this is the Texas building, then that's even better. Giving the exact floor, giving the portion of the building that they're in, all of those things help. Every police officer in the United States navigates by compass points. So if you know your compass points and you can give them, that's even more helpful. That would be something like he's in the northwest stairwell, or he's in the south wing, or he's heading down the east hallway. That lets every responding police officer immediately hone in on where this shooter is. Descriptions. Saying that he's a white guy is good because you just cut out about half the population. Saying he's a white guy, about 6'2", 250 pounds, he's bald headed, he's wearing glasses, wearing a blue shirt and blue pants, that's excellent. Because what that allows is it allows police officers who are responding to sweep through a crowd very, very quickly and determine whether or not the shooter's a part of that crowd. Locations of victims is important. Now, when we first started training after Columbine, we decided that the priority of work would be, we're going to go and stop the killing, and then we'll stop the dying. And for that reason, we're going to bypass all victims until we find the shooter. We've changed that paradigm now. That's not quite the same, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But what we want to do now is we want to know where the victims are. Because if we can't find the shooter, then our next priority is we're going to move to the victims and start giving them first aid. Now, back in 1999, firemen wouldn't come to the scene of an active shooting. Now, firemen across the United States are starting to partner with law enforcement, and they go into the building even while the shooter's at large and immediately start applying first aid. Knowing locations of victims will get those firemen there that much quicker. The next step is shelter and barricade. So when I say shelter and barricade, what I'm talking about is an interior shelter of your organization. An interior shelter can be any room that has a commercial grade door that's lockable. And by commercial grade, I mean a steel frame door with a solid wood core and a commercial grade lock like the one in this slide. If you're able to get behind a commercial grade door and lock it and barricade yourself, you are in a very safe place. And none of these active shooters that we've studied, is there any evidence to show that any previous active shooter has ever breached an interior commercial grade locked door? They just haven't done it. Now, there's been a couple of examples of shooting through glass doors to get into the initial building, but not a solid wood core door on the interior of the building. Now, you might say, Well, can he shoot through the door locks, or can he shoot through the hinges, or shoot through the door? Absolutely he can. But remember, he's done extensive planning. He knows what the response time for law enforcement is going to be, and he's looking for a soft target. And part of that soft target is easily accessed and a dense population of people. If you're behind a locked door, he doesn't know what the population is on the other side, and it's not easily accessed. He's not going to take the time to get through that one particular door, and I'll give you an example of this later. Also, if you're behind a solid wood door, that helps slow bullets down. Now, you can absolutely get shot on the other side of a door or the other side of a desk, but bullets kill in two ways: speed and mass. The faster the bullet and the bigger it is, the more deadly it is. So anything that you can put between you and the shooter that causes that bullet to start to fragment or to slow it down makes you safer. Now, I'm not advocating using a door or a desk for ballistic protection. I'm just saying that it could help slow a bullet down and cause it to fragment. Once you get behind that door, barricade it. Barricade it with everything you have, everything in the room, everything that you could stack up in front of that door. Now, you might say, well, the shooter could open that door and still shoot through that. Absolutely, he could. But what he couldn't do is just walk right in and start putting contact shots on his victims. He couldn't walk right up to the victim and put the gun on him and shoot him from point blank. He would have to fight his way through all that debris. And at that time would be the perfect time for the counterattack. In a minute, I'm going to tell you a story of where the debris in the room helped actually save a young lady's life. Here's another good example of barricading a door. Now, these doors, this isn't ideal. They open outwardly and they have glass in them. But you see, they turned out the lights and then they stacked up everything they possibly could in front of the doors to slow a shooter down. This is them making the best of a bad situation. Barricade that door with everything in the room: computers, desk, laptops, files, big boxes of copy paper. Anything you can put between yourself and the door increases your chances of safety. Here's another good example of using the available materials to barricade a door. This is an actual photo taken from the UCLA outward opening door with no locks. So this, why a school has classrooms without locks, I don't understand at this time and age. But this door did not have a lock. So they took cordage and they tied it to the hinge, and then they tied it to the desk in the room. Now, could the shooter get through that? Probably so. Would it take him some time? Absolutely. What you do in those 180 seconds absolutely matters. So let's say that the police officers are only 30 seconds away before the shooter gets to this door. Is he going to have time to get through it? Probably not. And then the last step is the counterattack. And what does counterattack mean? Counterattack means fighting back with everything you possibly can. Now, the great thing about this picture is each person in this picture is counterattacking with some sort of improvised weapon. When we talk about improvised weapons, what do we mean? An improvised weapon is an object that was not designed as a weapon, but that can be used as one. So think about the things that you have readily accessible to you in your organization. An office chair, a fire extinguisher is both great as an impact weapon and as a ranged weapon. A coffee pot, not only the hot liquid, but the glass pot itself. Canned food wrapped up in a t-shirt or a sock would be a great impact weapon. A 3-hole punch. Scissors are probably on almost every desk in America. A very heavy paperweight, a granite paperweight. Any blunt force object you can use to inflict damage. Improvised weapon, an object that was not designed as a weapon, but that can be used as one. Now, you might say, I can't fight somebody who has a gun and I do not. And I'm here to tell you that you absolutely can and you must. Now, counterattacking is the most appropriate response if you are in the room when the attack starts and you don't have the opportunity to evade, or you don't have the opportunity to shelter or barricade yourself. So you must fight back. The one thing you can't do is lay down and wait for your turn. Now, this picture is of a semi-automatic pistol. It's being held by the guy with the glove. And the guy who's not wearing the glove has grabbed the slide. I'm going to bring my cursor over here. I want to point out some things. For those in the audience who aren't familiar with firearms, the way this weapon works is every time he pulls the trigger, the hammer comes back and hits a firing pin, which detonates the primer, and then the primer detonates the gunpowder inside of the shell casing. That expanding gunpowder, expanding gas creates so much pressure, that's what pushes the bullet out of the barrel. That expanding gas also makes this entire piece of metal right here go backwards. And when it goes backwards, the old shell casing comes out and is expended, and a new bullet comes up. And then once the gas has been expended, a spring takes over and pushes this whole slide back forward. And that puts the gun back into battery, meaning it's able to fire again. Now, I'm no pistolero myself, but I routinely train where I draw and fire 4 rounds at a target in 1 second. That's a very reasonable rate of fire, 4 rounds per second. With a 17-round magazine, one in the chamber, you can see how it only takes a couple of seconds to shoot this gun and take all of the rounds out in its entirety. Reloads can take about 1 second to 2 seconds, and then they can have another magazine in. So you can see that this gun is 1, easily concealable, 2, can carry a lot of ammunition. It can be fired very, very fast. So how do you fight the person who has this gun? You do what this guy is doing right here. He's grabbing the slide. Now what happens if the guy in the glove pulls the trigger, it'll fire 1 round, the slide will not be able to cycle to the rear and then forward again, and that'll cause a malfunction in the gun. The gun will no longer be functional. There's plenty of examples of previous active shooters when they lose the functionality of their gun, they just abandon the gun. They don't know how to fix the malfunctions. Now, soldiers and police officers train on how to, they call them malfunction drills. They train how to clear a malfunction out of their weapon under duress. These guys are not warriors, they're cowards. And I'm not just saying they're cowards, just is some term to call them. They are the definition of cowards. Why else would they go to elementary schools or to churches and kill innocent people? That's a very cowardly act. These guys are not warriors, and they're not trained on how to handle these weapons and clear these malfunctions. And Parkland, I believe, when he had a malfunction, he laid his rifle down and he walked out with the other students. In Aurora, he had a malfunction and went out to get a different gun. They don't know how to clear these malfunctions. So once you grab the gun, just use your body weight and pull the gun to you and pull the gun away from their body and fall to the ground. Use your body weight to pull that gun away. It's not important that you maintain sole possession of the weapon. All you have to do is prevent him from having sole possession of the weapon. Now, what if he's using a rifle? This is the AR-15 again. This is a 30-round magazine. I'm going to point to it. This is a 30-round magazine. This weapon can shoot all 30 rounds every bit as fast as what I described earlier with the pistol. And you cannot cause a malfunction in the same way as you can with a pistol. So what do you do if somebody has a rifle? And this is effective for shotguns as well. You grab the barrel like the man with the silver hair has done and moved it away from your body, and then you grab the rest of the rifle and then you use your body weight to pull the rifle away, to pull it down to the ground. This is what the servicemen did on the train in France. The guy presented a rifle, they ran down and grabbed his rifle and pulled it to the ground. And the guy fell down with him, and then he tried to transition to another weapon, but by then the rest of the people had joined in the fight. There's also an active shooter in Tennessee, I believe, in a fast food restaurant where the would-be victim grabbed the rifle by the barrel and pulled it away. And the guy started shooting and it burned the would-be victim. The barrel's gonna be very, very hot, but he wasn't shot and he was able to wrestle the weapon away. Once again, it's not important that you have sole possession of the gun. The only thing that's important is make sure they don't have sole possession of the gun. And you may not be convinced yet that this is possible, but I'm going to tell you that every year in the United States, a significant portion of the police officers who are killed by gunfire are killed by their own gun. They've had their own weapon taken away from them and used against them. And the reason I bring that statistic up is to show how easy it is to take a weapon away from somebody. And these police officers have been through weapon retention school, and they've been through training on how not to get their gun taken away. The problem is to utilize a weapon properly, a handgun or a rifle, you have to hold it away from your body. And when you're holding it away from your body, it makes it very easy to take away. Use a pack mentality. I challenge each one of you to go to your office mates, whoever you share your office building with, the people in your church, the people in your social club, the people you spend time with, and swear or affirm a vow to each other that if y'all are ever in the room when an attack is launched, that you will all fight back, every one of you. And there's no reason why a gunman should be able to go into a church in South Texas and hold 40 or 50 people at bay, or go into a nightclub and hold 300 people at bay. He should not be able to do that. No matter who those people are, any 20 people can attack one gunman and subdue him fairly quickly. And you don't need fighting skills. All you have to do is be committed. Pull hair, eye gouge, bite, kick, claw, scratch. Do everything within your power and do it as a pack. You have to have the mentality that you're going to survive, no matter how overwhelming the odds seem. It doesn't matter if you feel like you're facing Goliath and you're David. You have to have that survival mentality. And you say, well, I may be shot. You may be shot, absolutely. But let's think about this. 59% of the time, the most powerful weapon used is a handgun. The vast majority of people in the United States that are shot by handguns live. A vast majority live. So that's a very survivable round. So you have to have the mindset, even if I'm shot, I can fight through it, I can survive. Now this is Virginia Tech, when we use it as a case study. Each one of these stones in the front represents one of the victims from that attack. The attack was pre-planned. The attacker knew that police response would be relatively fast, and he was trying to find a way to slow down the police response. So he took chains and he chained the doors shut. And then he went into the school building and he left a note on the door saying that this door has been wired to an IED, to a bomb. If you open it, it's going to blow up. Now, either a student or a teacher, I don't recall, walks by and he sees the sign and notices it and says, well, that's suspicious. I'm not going to go through that door because I don't want to get blown up, but then didn't call anybody. And that's an example of not being vigilant. Had that person been vigilant and said, you know what, this is likely some sort of attack that's going on, I need to call 911 immediately, then police response could have been that much quicker. Unbeknownst to anybody in that school building at that particular time is that the shooter had already committed a violent murder on campus a couple of hours earlier. Campus police being alerted to this murder and that it was a violent murder, something not typical of campus, called in the local police department. They came onto campus as well. So both police departments were already mobilized on campus looking for this violent murderer when he went into the school building and launched the attack. Because they didn't have the ability to reach all of the students at one time, there was no way to mass communicate that this threat was on the campus. So he locks the doors, he goes to the second story, it's a single hallway down the second story with classrooms on each side, and he starts to walk down the classrooms. And he walks in and he looks at everybody in the classroom, and then he steps out and he walks to the next classroom and he steps in and looks at everybody. I talked to a girl who was there and she said it was very creepy, it was very odd and unsettling. He steps in and he just looks around quietly and then walks out. She goes, it was obviously not a lost student. It was too late in the semester. Nobody had seen this guy before. Yet nobody took action. Nobody decided, hey, let me follow this guy out in the hallway and see what he's doing. Or, you know what, I don't know what's going on with that guy, but let's go ahead and just lock the door and shut it and make sure he doesn't come back in here. Nobody took any action. Now, we don't know because he's deceased. We don't know why he did that. My personal theory is that he was walking into each classroom and making sure that there was nobody in there that he felt was threatening to him, because he knew he was about to come back and attack that classroom, and he was looking around, say, for perhaps the Virginia Tech football team. But once he looked around and didn't see anybody he felt that was overly threatening to him, he came back and launched his attack. And he came back and walked into room 206 and shot 92% of the people in the room, killing 72%. Then he goes to room 211 and shoots 100% of the people in the room, killing 67%. So I talked to one of the girls that was there, and this is what she told me. I was going down the aisle shooting people. I'd laid there with my eyes closed, waiting for my turn to be shot. This is what we cannot do. This is what happens when you get caught in denial. This is what happens when you don't have a plan in place and you don't have a pre-planned response and knowing what to do. You cannot lay on the ground and wait for your turn to be shot. Now, when he walked into the corner of the room. The door was on the corner of the room up by the blackboard, and he walks in, he starts shooting immediately, shot the professor. Everybody in the room, she said, fell to the ground and all hid under their desk. Now you have 20 desks in the classroom, 20 students, 20 backpacks, 20 laptops, all this debris in the room. And the shooter started going up to the victims and shooting them, much like the guy in the slide, at point blank range, putting the pistol right up to him and pulling the trigger. And he killed everybody in the front of the room. But he couldn't fight his way through all the debris, or it would take too much time to fight his way through all the debris. So he just took ranged shots at this survivor. He shot her 3 times, but he shot her from across the room. So the people that were in the front, he was able to execute point blank, but the people at the back, he just wasn't that good of a shot. And while he hit them, he didn't kill them, and then he left. So this is a perfect example of how just a little bit of debris between you and the shooter can be the difference between surviving and not surviving. Then he goes to room 207, he shoots 85% of the people in the room, killing 38%. Then this is where we start to see a bit of a success story. In room 204, the professor is a Holocaust survivor. And being a Holocaust survivor, he immediately recognized the sounds of gunfire. He immediately recognizes that this is a violent attack underway, and he takes immediate action. Now, he didn't have a plan, but he did take immediate action. And he ran up to the door and he slammed the door shut and he put his shoulder in it to block the door. And then he started telling his students to jump out the window. And they're told, but it's a 19-foot drop to the ground outside. And he demands they jump, and they start jumping. Every single person who jumped out of the window survived. Well, the shooter made it to the door, and he tried to get in the door, and he realized it was being barricaded, not locked, but barricaded. And so he takes a step back and he shoots through the door, striking the professor, who then falls to the ground. The shooter is then able to access the room, and he shoots the remaining students in the room. 36% of the original population of the room were shot, 14% were killed. Just that slight action of delaying, of barricading the door, we had a dramatic increase in the survival rate in this room. But our true success story is in room 205. In 205, the students took a desk and they pushed it up against the door, and then they laid down on the floor and used their combined body weight to barricade the desk against the door. When the shooter got to this room, he tried the door, could tell that it was barricaded, not locked. He takes a step back, he shoots through this door, hits no one because they're all laying on the ground behind the desk, tries the door again, realizes he's not going to be able to make entry into this room, and leaves. He made one attempt after he found out the door was barricaded to get through it. And as soon as he realized he wasn't going to be able to get through, he abandoned it altogether. 0% were shot in that room and 0% were killed. So let's talk about the police response. Now, quite often, when the police respond, as soon as they go on scene, the shooter's going to turn their attention away from the public and towards the police or commit suicide. And a lot of times they commit suicide immediately upon learning that the police were there. In the Virginia Tech, as soon as he heard the police downstairs, he committed suicide. These guys are not interested in fighting it out with the police. They don't want to get shot, they don't want to get hurt, and they don't want to be captured. They have no interest in being in armed conflict. So police response will look a lot like this or like this. It's something important to note is that most police officers are trained to look over their weapon as they're moving. This is a tactic they use so that they can get on their sights quicker if a threat were to present themselves. The young lady at Virginia Tech told me it was very unsettling that she'd just been shot by a stranger, and then she heard what she believed to be her rescuers coming, And the first thing they did when they burst through the doors was point more guns at her. She said it was very traumatic. That's why I added it to this presentation. Just understand that that's the way police officers are trained in a high threat scenario like this. They're going to be pointing their weapons and looking over their weapons. Much like this guy here next to the man with the shield. He's looking right over his weapon where he's moving. Now, the police priority of work, I've already alluded to it, is that we're going to stop the killing and then stop the dying. So if we have actionable intel, actionable intelligence that says this is where the shooter is, we're bypassing everything and moving to the shooter as fast as we possibly can. If we don't have actionable intel where the shooter is, then we're going to move to where the victims are and start applying first aid to the victims. Now, I want you to take a second to think of the police perspective. I'll give you 2 seconds to view the next slide. So how many firearms did you see and who had them? So I will show you the slide again. There's nobody in this picture who has a firearm on them. But I can tell you from firsthand experience that gunfire inside of a building is definitely loud. It's very, very loud. Now, 61% of these shooters have some sort of connection to the facility that's attacked, which means in a high school shooting, quite often the shooter is a high school student. And a business shooting, quite often the shooter is a business person of that business or a customer of that business. What that means to police is that the shooter is going to look like everybody else, and they're not going to be able to differentiate easily without a description. So can you imagine if you're the police officer and you're coming down this hall and you hear gunfire and then you see this come running around the corner? That'd be very threatening, and the margin for error is very, very small. So what you need to do to help the police understand that you're not a threat to them is keep your hands up. This is the international symbol for I am not a threat to you. Hands up, palms forward, fingers spread, nothing in your hands. No matter where you go, any culture in the world, that says I'm not a threat to you. Follow directions. The police officers may give you directions that don't make sense, but they're all trained in such a way to get the maximum result with the least amount of directions. So if you follow their directions immediately, it helps the police officers move more quickly through a facility. Move slowly. This is probably good advice for any time you're dealing with a police officer. You never want to make a quick movement. That's what police officers call the furtive movement. Move slowly, show them that you're not a threat to them. That way, they can scan an entire crowd of people and determine whether or not there's a threat there, and then move on trying to find that shooter that much faster. We'll talk a minute about the aftermath. These are extremely traumatic events. The facility that's attacked will become a crime scene, and that crime scene is going to be held for a period of time. It could be days or it could even be weeks. Rescued victims will be held. So I'm sure you've seen on videos of previous active shooter events, a lot of the students running out of the building with their hands on their head. That's because law enforcement doesn't know that the shooter is not actually one of them, like in the Parkland shooting, or there might be a co-conspirator in there. So they're going to hold those rescue victims and they're going to vet them very, very quickly, trying to find out if anybody has actionable intel, actually saw the shooter, can identify the shooter, and so on and so forth. Expect mental trauma. Now, talking about mental trauma, let's talk about PTSD. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. In a nutshell, not to put too much a final point on it, but in a nutshell, what PTSD is, it's a trigger, some sort of memory, and a physiological response. Your body has a physical response to a memory. An example of a trigger could be something like when you pass by a bakery and you smell bread and then suddenly you get hungry. So there's a trigger and a physiological response. But with PTSD, the trigger is going to be something that links you back to that traumatic event. And the physiological response is a very unpleasant roller coaster ride of emotions. It has flashbacks, it has shock, nightmares, there's adrenaline, increased breathing, increased heart rate, all these things that happen whenever the trigger comes up. There's also a thing called survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt is when you look over at somebody who's the victim of something very tragic and violent, and you think to yourself, oh my goodness, I'm so glad it was them and not me. That's a natural human response. But then the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, you start thinking about what a terrible person you are. And that person had a family, and that person had kids, and that person had a wife or a husband, and they didn't deserve that. And you can't believe that you thought that. It's a natural human response. And sharing this response with other people will teach you that that's a natural human response. And how do you share? You share in a debrief, a professional counselor-led debrief. And what that is every person in the organization that was involved during that event shows up and they all tell their stories. And what happens was when you hear other people telling their story, you realize, one, that you're not the only person who's going through it, but two, that it's not all your fault. So that survivor's guilt. It also fills in gaps. A lot of times during violent encounters, the human brain misses things for whatever reason. They have tunnel vision or they have auditory exclusion. They don't hear things, they don't see things, they remember things incorrectly. But when you hear the collective debrief, it fills in those gaps with what actually happened instead of what your brain filled in the gaps. Counseling. Counseling, I can't advocate for counseling strong enough. Now, we've all heard about the 22 veterans a day that are killing themselves from PTSD. What a tragedy to survive the wars and then come home and fall victim to PTSD and commit suicide. Police officers commit suicide at a rate probably somewhere between 2 and 3 times line of duty deaths. We all acknowledge being a police officer is a very dangerous job, but what a tragedy to survive the streets and then fall victim to PTSD. So what a tragedy it would be to survive an active shooter and then fall victim to PTSD. There's no point in surviving the actual attack if you're going to fall victim to PTSD later. The way you prevent PTSD from taking hold is professional counseling. I can't say this strongly enough. There's a process called EMDR, which I'm not going to get into the science of it, but what it does is it allows the counselor to separate the trigger, the memory, and that could be anything, the sight of somebody, a piece of clothing, the sight of a gun, the smell of gunpowder, whatever that trigger is, it separates that trigger from the response, that emotional roller coaster that comes with it. So there's no shame in going to see a heart doctor when your heart hurts, right? There's no shame in to go to a doctor when you have a cold. Well, this is a different kind of doctor for a different kind of problem. Absolutely important to go get counseling. Next is training. So once you've established your plan, you've identified the interior shelters in your facility, places that you can go and barricade yourself behind a commercial grade door. You've made your pact with your coworkers. You've worked on your alert system. You've got your communication system down to where you can reach all of your employees simultaneously or as fast as possible. You're all committed to the counterattack if needed. Then you need to train, test the alert. If you don't have the technology, then do the oral alert. If you have the technology, test it, make sure that it works. That gives you confidence. Run tabletop exercises where you all sit around the table and talk about what an active shooter would look like and what everybody would do. Then do walkthroughs. During that walkthrough is when you might find not everybody can fit in the copy room. You know, everybody in the building can be saying, hey, I'm headed to the copy room to shelter in place, and there's 50 people in the building and only 10 fit in the copy room. Walkthroughs will expose those types of problems. And then run full scenarios. Actually go out and have somebody walk through the building saying bang, 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 and everybody full speed enact their evading and their plan and their sheltering in place so they can get a feel for what it would actually be like. And then medical training. I'm just going to touch lightly on medical training. There's tourniquets, which are about $30 on Amazon that you can get called CAT tourniquets. Very effective at stopping the bleeding from an appendage. You can bleed to death from an arterial bleed in 3 minutes, from an arm bleed or leg bleed. Or you could put on a tourniquet and be treated and released the same day. That's how effective they are. So they're easily accessible. You can get them on Amazon for $30. Also, for any sort of gunshot wound to the torso, you just want to cover it and prevent air from getting into the body cavity. A lot of times when somebody's shot somewhere around the chest or in the stomach and air gets in, it causes the lung to collapse, and that's what actually kills them. So you just want to cover those holes until law enforcement or first responders arrive. So no plan is panic, fear, and indecision. If I were to tell you, hey, I want you to be in a wedding, which most of us probably have at some point in our lives, I want you to be in a wedding and there's going to be 500 attendants and it's going to be televised. And not only do I want you to be the best man or the maid of honor, we're not going to practice the day before. And oh, by the way, would you mind reading these two passages out of the Bible, or out of the Torah, or out of the Quran? Nobody would want to do that. You would be like, absolutely not. I'm not going to do that. But then if you went and practiced it, then you'd be fine. Like, yeah, one practice, stand here, hand the ring over. I can do that. That's the difference between not having a plan and having a plan. Children, every child in America knows how to walk out of the classroom and run to the playground or run to the parking lot in every school in America. Yet they still do fire drills. And why do they do those fire drills? Because in a time of panic and fear, they want those kids to respond in an exact way. So they have them line up while the fire alarm is going off and march out of the building, so that, God forbid, if the building ever was on fire, the kids would know exactly what to do. That's having a plan. That's fear inoculation. That's exposing those children in a very small way to what would be a horrific event, but training them how to respond. Having a plan is fear inoculation. Having a plan is the difference between surviving and not surviving in an active shooter event. So I implore you to plan now. This is my call to action to you. Up until this point, we've done nothing but talk about this problem. But if you go back and you make a plan and you test the alert system and you make a vow with your coworkers to fight and you identify these interior shelters and you know where your escape routes are and you teach your family to look for a secondary exit whenever they're out in public, then you're actually putting a plan into place and increasing your chances of survival should you ever find yourself in one of these events. Because ultimately, that's my goal for you guys, is to survive.
Thank you so much, Jay, for that really powerful and informative presentation. We're now going to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have any questions, just type them into the chat box. And any that we don't get to today, we're going to be sure to respond to on our blog, which you can find at alertfind.com/blog. So Jay, we've got one question here. How can I get my colleagues more involved and more comfortable with the idea of active shooter training?
I think that's a good question. I think talking about it is the first step, and just acknowledging that this threat exists. Our website, activeshooterassessment.com, is a great resource in that they could come to the website and do a 10-question questionnaire really, really quick. And then it would give them a very real assessment of how prepared they actually are. And doing this with your coworkers might be a way to show that, hey, our plan is lacking, like we really are exposed here. And just that in and of itself may be enough to get the conversation going.
Great. And another one here, how often do we do active shooter exercises? Or how often should we? I'm sorry.
I think for schools, once a semester, once in the fall, once in the spring is appropriate. But for businesses, I think once a year is probably enough. If it's a large business, there could be a portion of it in the new hire portion when they come to the business and they go through the orientation. But for the entire business at large, I think once a year is enough. The concepts aren't difficult. It's just a matter of pre-planning them and having them pre-scripted in your mind what kind of response you'll have.
Great. And then the next one is, what other departments should I pull into our active shooter planning or active shooter training planning?
Other departments as in public safety, or other departments within the business?
I think other departments within the business.
Well, I think I would start with human resources. One, not only is that central repository of information that I talked about for suspicious person reports, But also, that's the department that's most well designed for dealing with these types of personnel issues and the whole company culture of how they're going to respond to these type of events.
Great, and perfect timing because the next one is actually about that repository of information. So we always hear about warning signs about the shooter after the fact. How can companies set up a centralized reporting program for employees to help prevent incidents?
So it's as simple as identifying who that employee is going to be. It could be the director of HR, it could be somebody within HR, it could be the school principal, it could be the shop manager, it could be the floor manager, it could be the general manager, just whoever it is that you identify. And once you identify, then you need to come up with a way for people to report to them, either via email, face to face, internal messaging. Through AlertFind, they have the ability to, all of the employees have the ability to reach out to an administrator. You can identify one of your administrators as being the person who's going to take these types of reports. What's important is that people actually make the reports, and then the person who's responsible for them takes them seriously. If anybody's making these types of suspicious statements like suicidal or homicidal ideations or declaring some sort of affinity or support of other active shooters, those are things that are absolutely need to be reported to law enforcement.
Great. And I think we've got one more here, which is our office has all glass walls. Do you recommend bulletproof glass for these types of offices?
Absolutely, if your budget can afford it, but it probably can't because bulletproof glass is very expensive. So, a lot of our workspaces are open and they're warm, they're inviting, or think about a cubicle farm where there's no walls at all. And that's part of the pre-planning. You have to think about what would I do if I were attacked here, right? And the best answer is going to be to get away. By far, the safest thing you can do is get away from the shooter. You just have to realize I can't fall to the ground and just hide here behind this glass wall or start begging for mercy. That's what you can't do. You have to realize the limitations of the building that you're in. And most of us don't have the luxuries just to go out and redesign whatever workspace we're in. So we have to adapt ourselves and our plan to that workspace.
Great. And thank you so much. Those are all of the questions that we have time for. But if anyone submitted a question that we weren't able to answer, we're going to do our best to get an answer to your question up on our blog. And I want to mention a couple more things. The first is that Jay mentioned the active shooter assessment tool. Jay worked with us at AlertFind to create this incredible tool that's 10 questions that asks you about your organization's active shooter preparedness, and then gives you specific advice for how you can improve and make your plan more solid within the organization. You can find that in the resources section of alertfind.com or at activeshooterassessment.com. And a little bit about us. AlertFind is an emergency notification system for emergency preparedness professionals. And like Jay mentioned, rapid notification is really crucial to implementing an active shooter response plan. So if you want to see how we can help you create a better emergency communication plan, you can see a demo and you can email me, Danielle Ricci, or you can, request a demo through alertfind.com at any time. And if you have any follow-up questions for Jay, here's his email address. Thanks everyone for attending our webinar today, and thank you, Jay, so much for everything that you shared with us today. This is really crucial information, and I'm so thankful that you spent so much time with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.